You are listening to Cemetery Confessions, the world's #1 goth talk podcast.
All right, hello and welcome back to Cemetery Confessions. This week we are taking a look at runway fashion and the claims of commodification. We'll also be discussing topics around how goth aesthetics have been used on the runway and in high fashion, and whether or not a postmodernist view of style and culture is the reason for this, or if there's something else going on. We'll also be reviewing the new album from Sólveig Matthildur, and we've got Sinister Suggestions and a lot more. So as always, I am the Count, and I'm here with my co-host Trey. Hello, Trey.
Hello, Count.
And our guest this month is Cece. Hey, Cece, thanks for coming on.
Hey.
So, as we like to do, tell us a little about yourself, sort of how you were first introduced to goth and why that was meaningful enough to you to kind of stick around and stay part of the scene.
It's something I really kind of grew into. Because early childhood, it was always like unicorns and rainbows and stuff. And so like it wasn't something that I really found interest in until maybe my early teens, like 12, 14, after we moved from like Chicago to Joliet. And that was like discovering my own fashion style, because it was always like my mom always told me what to wear, what not to wear, that sort of thing. And it was just like, oh, now I've had my phase of pastel colors, and now I just want to fade all the way to black. So it's something I grew up with and something that stuck with me like to this day. And it's been only getting better and navigating my way around dressing every day.
So if it was fashion first, have you gotten into, or at what point did you get into like checking out goth music or anything like that?
Roughly about the same time. Pretty much I grew up with a variety of like music. I grew up listening to like oldies and pop, 90s pop, new wave from the 90s. And then as like I turned into my teens, 12, 13, 14, it just blended into like new metal. And I always tell people my taste of music varies from like abhorrent to completely disgusting, because I will like have a complete interest in Britney Spears from the beginning of her discography to her Glory album, which is the last one she came out with like last year. And then I will literally school you in virtually every single Rammstein song that you can possibly imagine. And like it goes like generational too. Like, we'll go start seeing the Banshees and Sisters of Mercy, The Mission, and a lot of stuff from like the early 90s, goth rock. And then to like kind of like new generational stuff. There's like a couple of bands that are, touching on the goth rock scene. And it's actually one I went to go see, I think it was 2 months ago now, the 69 Eyes. I actually went to go see them over at the Forge.
Oh, yeah.
And so it was really cool. It was like their comeback tour after a decade. So it was like, whoa, this is like way cool. And it was very surprising how many people were actually at that show. So, goth rock is still alive for the most part, I'd say.
Thanks for coming on. It's a pleasure to have you and hang out with you. We're going to be, as fate would have it, chatting about fashion. So let's get into this. We're looking at an article that was posted a couple months ago, but it's obviously relevant to today and the foreseeable future. So the title of this article is Why Goth Culture is Condemned to be a Fashion Inspiration. This is a favorite topic of YouTubers over the years, but hopefully I think I've got some different spins to put on what's being discussed here. So let's just jump into the beginning of the article and get started talking about some of these issues. So the author says, during this past fashion show season, one of the most talked about collections was the runway debut of Bottega Veneta under its new creative director, Daniel Lee. Formerly of Celine, brought a certain Celine-ness to the collection and its rigorous tailoring. But more striking was its dark, hard edge, a decidedly obvious departure from the band's staid bourgeois luxury. Is that how you pronounce that?
Bourgeois.
Yeah.
Bourgeois. Okay.
Well, bourgeois, but bourgeois is close enough.
Bourgeois. You have to like take a drag from a cigarette and then say it, I think is how that works. At Prada, the inspiration was a fictional Frankenstein's bride with models sporting black lace, combat boots, and Wednesday Addams tails. Even Marnie, the effervescent, silly Marnie, went full-on goth with black lipstick and chains. At the Comme de Garçon. I should have practiced this before we started recording.
Comme des Garçons.
After that show in Paris, Ray put on a goth-tinged show whose theme was The Gathering of Shadows. The appropriately solemn music was done by the Instagram famous DJ Parma Ham, whose most defining feature is his mega mohawk. And I just insert it. They use the wrong pronoun for Parma, so maybe I should editorialize they in there, but they wrote his. There is no denying that goth culture is having a moment in fashion. Why? Okay, so let's just start here. What are your general thoughts on runway fashion and general thoughts on the use of goth on the runway?
In present day culturally, I would say goth is more fighting in between being nostalgia and being like an actual lifestyle. So being like seeing like goth fashion really being a thing like on the runway in particular, we'll see like, okay, it's like a nostalgic subculture because, you know, we've seen many different variations of goth come through over the years, depending on like where you are, what type of scene you're in, and somehow goth was incorporated into that. You know, you have pretty much like, I would say the most recent goth spinoff probably would have been steampunk. And there was a lot of like synchronicity in between like, steampunk being like one of the most popular fashion styles or concepts of recent ages compared to like say the Victorian style, which is definitely like more or less nostalgic, but you know, we don't have professional like funeral criers at the same time. So it's much less of like a lifestyle thing as it is, because it's now you have pastel goth now where, you know, it's brighter, more like happy, positive. And then actually you have some more of the Japanese concepts of goths that touch on the darker aspects, sickness, illness, depression, mental illness, that sort of thing, and kind of brings that out into a more positive light. There's actually a specific name for it, but it's a subset of like visual K, where it's actually a lot like brighter, positive, and it's like, you know, people smile about being ill. So it's more Western side of it, kind of like a fight between like staying nostalgic and, you know, being a way of life.
I'm glad. If professional funeral crier was something I could get into, I would be all over that.
Honestly, like I would totally do that. I told myself, like, you know, when I get to be like ancient and feeble and like not really walk anymore, I'm just gonna dress up in like my best like 1700s clothing and go to random people's funerals and cry.
They're also death midwives.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, there is. Death midwives, death doulas is something that's something I've read into a little bit, you know, and it's literally you take care of the person that they're in the life cycle. And I have a significant interest in say like animal hospice. It's very much similar, the same thing where, you know, the animal's end of life, you go there, take care of them, pamper them, make them feel good, you know, as they continue on to the next phase. So
yeah. And I also just want to say I like that you brought up that the fashion is contextual, based around what scene you're in, who you're around, and that kind of thing. That's something I'm going to get into. I want to talk about later on when she starts bringing up postmodernism and that kind of thing. But Trey, as far as like runway fashion itself or goth aesthetics on the runway, what are your general thoughts about that?
As far as runway fashion, I enjoy runway fashion just because of the sheer absurdity sometimes, but also sometimes the really fascinating combinations of shapes and textures. And I mean, it is wildly impractical, but that's, by design. Nobody ever really buys runway fashion for any sort of practical usage. It's meant as a showcase, as more of an abstract art within the fashion milieu, rather than trying to design practical clothing for practical people. So I enjoy it from that creative bent. As far as the use of goth, I think the reporting of it is overblown, because I think what often happens is that the reporting on the fashion just keys on some abstract thing, whether it is they're wearing a predominance of black, or the black lipstick and chains, whatever they choose to decide to describe. And then the fashion report, whatever magazine is reporting on the show, goes, oh, so-and-so is doing goth, when if you probably ask the designer, they wouldn't be saying, oh yeah, I took inspiration from this goth fashion thing, or this trend from the 80s or the 90s, or whatever they want to pick it from, because there are just lots of elements that are currently commonly portrayed as, oh, this is a goth thing, that could have a lot of other touchstones. I mean, they mentioned several things in here, like the let's see, they go with the black lace, combat boots, Wednesday Addams tails. Black lace, well, that could you just show a reference to Victorian. Combat boots, 50s and 60s motorcycle fashion, military fashion. Wednesday Addams, she's from the 60s. That can't be goth, right? So, I mean, there are a lot of things now that people portray or people perceive as a goth thing, but I don't think that's always the core inspiration. And just because the reports are keying on what's the popular thing now, goth having its moment, so goth is the buzzword, and everything black is goth, is less a fault of, I think, the fashion industry, and more a fault of those who report on it, who are oftentimes not part of the fashion industry, but more parts of the celebrity gossip genre of reporting.
Yeah, this is something that is inevitably going to be talked about, where we get into the sort of, where's the, who's using these symbols, how are they being used, where's the substance, the essence, the mimesis or whatever of this thing, and how do we determine what is and isn't a use of the goth style. But as far as runway fashion, so like I even had, before we did this episode, I had a protracted conversation with Parma Ham, because I wanted to get their perspective on why they think runway fashion is good, because I personally still don't. I have difficulty relating to it and finding it relevant in any way. Like the reasoning I've heard in the past is that the sort of, as you mentioned, impractical and unaffordable runway concepts sort of become inspiration for clothing that we get to buy at some point, and that can become daily wear, and that justifies the relevance of a runway show to the average person. But it's hard for me to look at something like Met Gala, which I know people love, but it just gives me a lot of Hunger Games vibes, because you have the bougie upper class leisure lifestyles being celebrated with ultimate excess of this wearable art that you put on once and then never wear again, and then you do the same thing next season. And I know that there are people who are really into art and creating art and pushing the limits and that kind of thing, but runway fashion appears to me, from the outside at least, as this novelty that only those who can afford lavish excess can really get into, which makes it hard for me to relate. So like, there's a difference between, they mentioned one, I don't know who any of these designers are. I looked up one of them, which was Bottega Veneta, to see if they only do runway stuff or if they have a website. And they do have a website where you can buy their fashion. And the first thing I saw when I went to their site was, I clicked on it. It's just a plain white skirt. That's all it is. And it's $990. And it's just like, these people are living in another planet than I am. And I just don't understand. And like the relation to Parma, they bring Parma up because they did, They were basically just involved with using their music. But I think what they do with Runway stuff, I think is different because Parma is trying to use a platform to push some form of social change. So a number of things that I think that they've done and that I think can be done with runway fashion is stuff like pointing out how fast fashion does harm to the environment and like the workers in third world countries that don't get paid a living wage, pointing out how the industry has had problems with anorexia and like body shaming. Parma's really into like pushing gender boundaries because they've done shows with drag shows in just industrial basements where like everybody has access to it, which I think is good. And then just like general DIY and upcycling ethics. I think those are important. But in general, from mainstream runway stuff, I don't think you get any of, at least I don't get any of that. It just seems to be these unobtainable, expensive fashions that don't resonate with a peasant like myself. So that's,
I guess the counterpoint I'd put to that is that they're definitely on runway fashions. The idea of gender boundaries and what clothing is for which gender is very much played with on the runway, where it's not in regular fashion. There are plenty of runway shows that will have women in men's clothing, men in women's clothing, or at least feminized or masculinized clothing. They will definitely play with that. And from the upcycling point of view, one thing that I always find interesting about runway fashion is the use of unusual materials in fashion, which, while when you look at these pieces here and you want an exact replica, sure, you're looking at thousands of dollars for this custom design thing. But somebody looking at it from a DIY perspective might think, oh, I didn't know I could use a gas can as part of my outfit. And you could get some of those ideas because they're not just using standard fabrics and patterns. They've got all kinds of weird things that are put on for accessories or changes of shape, changes in structure that can be leveraged into a DIY aesthetic just to give somebody who's into that additional ideas of creative things they can combine. So looked at that way, it can be an interesting melting pot of ideas. Your points about the body type issues and just some of the general, as you say, bourgeois issues with the fast fashion, or I guess it's not fast fashion in this instance, the name brand fashion, the out of the reach of the common person fashion. Those are definitely some problems that need to be addressed, and there have been plenty of designers who have been starting to address the body shape issue, and there have been some runway shows who have been concentrating on non-standard body types, but it is still the norm with the skinny models that are just a totally unrealistic body type for the vast majority of humanity. Mm-hmm. So it's got its faults, it's got its problems, but I think it does have some value, and I'd say it has as much to say as any other high art kind of thing. There's definitely a bourgeois sensibility to some degree when you go to any sort of art museum or high art concert. They're not designed for, mass produced public consumption. And so they are a premium price and usually exclusive, for better or for worse. So I can get the Hunger Games thing, but I don't think that's unique to fashion. It is simply the art world as separate from the standard, proletariat world.
Fair points. Cool. All right. So let's see. Let's move on here. So the author goes on to say, every time fashion turns dark, it begets plenty of pontificating on the part of the fashion journalists about it reflecting the darkness of current events. There could be a degree of truth to this, but perhaps there is something simpler at work. Goth culture is one of the few musical subcultures with very clearly defined, recognized, and therefore easily copied aesthetic codes. Black lace, black leather, combat boots, S&M accessories, often mixed with religious symbols. Put that together with black makeup for girls and boys and unconventional hairstyles, and you've got a recipe. Perhaps in its chasing of inspiration, fashion turns to goth subculture every handful of years simply because designers run out of things to reference. For many designers whose design methods are not tethered to specific cultural roots, inspiration is a kind of a color wheel. You keep turning it, and another theme comes up until you've turned the wheel full circle and start all over again. The last time I noticed this was in 2013, when even the tacky Roberto Cavalli got in on the game. Yeah, let's talk about this idea of goth style as a formula in a sense. I guess when it comes to goth fashion for you or for what you see in the wild, do you feel like there is, whether or not you agree with their specific, signifiers, do you think there is a kind of reducible or a few defined elements that you can point to and say, this is what makes a goth look?
I would say yes. And I think kind of going back, it kind of depends on like the environment. Like you'll look at, especially different like goth subcultures. Like you have the Rivethead, you have like the cyber goth, you have the corporate goth, especially. So either of those, and even going to like traditional goth, either of those breaks down to a few definitely like simple elements. Sometimes it will be conflated with religious symbols, maybe a rebellious symbol like, St. Peter's cross, the upside down cross, what have you. Sometimes pagan symbols. Sometimes it'll, the basis generally is black. That pretty much, that's what brings it to mind. You can wear like a black t-shirt and black yoga pants, like I'm literally wearing today, and be like, oh, they're so dark. It's like, okay, like, I just got this from Walmart, thanks. So it's kind of, I would say that yes, it does bring it down to a certain basic element. These like the dark undertones, the makeup, especially we talked about earlier, the play with gender, absolutely brings it down to, because it's generally like in the more, I guess, mainstream sense, maybe less so today, because, guys wear makeup. You see a guy wearing eyeliner, guyliner, if you will.
Ugh,
I know it's
so fucking.
It's like really
we have to
it's
masculinize
a guy
everything.
wearing eyeliner,
or like, have you seen like they branding stuff now like dude wipes?
Yes. Oh my God. So
stuff like that.
Let me tell you, I work at Amazon and people order that like hotcakes. Okay.
Really?
I kid
That's
you not.
amazing.
Yeah, it is super thing. You would be surprised. And, it's in this nice dark black box and it's like blue highlighting. And me personally, I'm just like, yo, this box looks cool as heck. I want that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
definitely like when it really comes down to it, that fashionably speaking, yeah, it really does come down to like a few simple elements. And I would even say like more or less recently today, with goth fashion, it's a very like, it's kind of polarized between subtle and like super extreme. Like you're going to find that one person that goes all out with, and then you have like pretty much the more subtle goth where it's going to be like skinny jeans, maybe some black high tops, it's going to be a lot milder, regular black hair, a lot more subtle. So, with it, whether or not it's goth comes down to a few like simple elements, and that's removing goth completely just as fashion, not as like a cultural lifestyle.
Right. Yes. Okay. All right, Trey, what do you think about defining a goth look in terms of specific items?
Well, I'm going to end this with a return question, but I'll start with trying to do some definitions here. As far as I can tell, it's usually something it has the appearance of being very clearly put together. It rarely looks like it was just tossed together when we're talking people who are going out. It usually has, black as the underlying color. Not that that's unique to goth, but that is the thing that's most keyed upon, is the use of black. To typically some high contrast is often there, but not always. It is typically it's consciously divergent from the norm, but not usually with the same sense of hostility that a punk fashion would have, where it's not just diverging from the norm, but actually sticking it to the man kind of thing. That's not so common in goth, though not impossible in goth either. But I think that's one thing that kind of distinguishes goth fashion from just flat out punk or even some metal fashion, where there are elements of that fashion sense, which typically is directly geared to punch somebody's buttons. That's kind of a core focus in those styles, where goth doesn't tend to do that as much. So I guess, yeah, that's kind of a rough, very vague definition that tries to avoid pigeonholing into specific styles of goth and tries to give an overarching theme. The question I have is the counter question is, what is unique to goth fashion that isn't a reflection of or something borrowed from a predecessor, be it, as I already mentioned, the aforementioned punk style, or as we already mentioned, callbacks to Victorian mourning clothes, or makeup styles from the film noir or black and white early 20s era of film. What in goth fashion was created from goth rather than being an amalgamation of other past styles that has been combined to become this goth aesthetic?
I don't think there is.
Honestly, no, I can't think of anything.
Basically, Andy Harriman talks about bricolage, which I want to touch on later. You talk about something like rosaries, or those Junkyard Bet and chat brings up the nose to ear chains. That's not, that's a very goth looking thing, but it's not.
It's not
It's
really
also traditional Indian.
Yeah, exactly. So I do think it is a goth fashion is basically a collection of stuff from other places just presented in a different way. And to get into my views on whether you can reduce goth looks to specific elements, I think that's I think it's more contextual than that and nuanced than that. And it's why you get these sort of stuff gets called goth by fashion journalists that is clearly clockable as not goth by goths, because you have context, and you have music and lifestyle and other things that are influencing the presentation of the look. And when you detach that stuff from the aesthetic, I think it generally makes it easier to say this is someone dressing more in a costume. And I think that the mistake a lot of these articles make, like this one, is focusing on, and she does try to explain this, and I'll give my rebuttal to that, but focusing on the materiality of what is, which misses out on the individual expression of that, the performativity or the phenomenology of the experience and the identity of the individual. One
quick point, I believe the author is male.
Is okay.
Eugene Rapkin.
Okay, all right. My bad. I will try and fix that going forward when I refer to them. I kind of want to explain and unpack that phenomenology side of it. I'll try and be brief here, but basically what that means is that the interpretations of goth style on the runway are missing out on wearing a goth style as a outward manifestation of an internal reality. And I'm not trying to, just for philosophers listening, I'm not trying to say there is some immutable essence of goth within a person. I'm saying this is like a constructed reality for an individual. So I think this is kind of why you can tell when someone who is a goth or someone who is wearing a goth outfit, because of the ways that those clothes connect to the person's personality, their experiences, their identity, their relationship with the world around them and their various communities. And that doesn't usually exist for a runway model or a designer. And so that lack of experience and phenomenological expression leads to this feeling of someone wearing a costume rather than someone being a goth. All right, what did I want to say about this? Okay, so here's starting to get into some like the ways that academics or people try to interpret fashion. So when you reduce fashion to a set of characteristics, this is basically something that one of the first schools of sociology was trying to do, and they use this basically semiotic approach, which basically means that you view subcultural style as a series of items or ephemera that have sort of secret meanings that are coded resistance to order. So the individual items have a specific meaning to the subculture, and then you can view subculture basically as a series of items that can be read and decoded because they're static and accepted subversions of something. So the problem with this, though, is it divorces fashion from the world it exists in and how it was created in collaboration with the music and the individual person and the community that they're a part of. So I don't think that the look of goth can be a set of static items that just exist apart from anything else. And that's part of this idea of goth fashion as a dialogue, as being dialectical. It's not just a thing that we put on. It's a manifestation of something personal that is in interaction with other people and our friends and ourselves and our environment. And it's fluid in that sense. It's not these things are goth looks and that is it for all time. At least that's my opinion.
Well, I think that's part of why, when it comes to defining goth as a culture, you have your homology hypothesis, which I think is viable, which is why it's not just fashion. So when you break down the fashion, you're not really breaking down the culture. You're just breaking down a fashion, which is an element of presentation, a form of art. And as far as fashion in the large sense is concerned, when it comes to these runway shows, et cetera, it is simply a form of art, which, at least in my opinion, art's purpose is to communicate. And since fashion is purely visual, it's not like music, which, at least in the popular sense, has lyrics that give it additional textual content. It's more akin to visual arts, though a lot of visual arts can also have text involved that give it meaning. A lot of fashion is a purely visual medium. It's just based on reference, really. Because there's nothing that, in my mind, a vaguely triangular shaped element of fabric that's draped over the lower half of the body says about anything explicitly, but it's got some cultural accumulated meaning based on gender roles and fashion styles and changing styles over history, since of course it's not always been a female article of clothing. So really, fashion gets a lot of its meaning through referencing things, and given the prominence of the goth aesthetic, it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that is oftentimes used in a semiotic sense as a way of communicating something through touchstones or visual references to the style. Whether they're trying to do a goth look or not is its own issue, but I don't think usually they are. But they're trying to take some of the fundamental meaning, some of the meanings that our society has put on or gathered from goth, or at least those goth visual markers, and using that to communicate something. And it's really up to both the artist who's doing it as well as the person seeing the art to determine how that communication is happening.
Right. And I think part of it is just, at the very least, we have to ascribe context to those things, because if this specific item has this cultural meaning used in a different context, it can have a different or even mutually exclusive cultural meaning.
Mhm.
So I don't think it's a fully formed static thing that,
Mhm.
because then that gets into, well, I'll get into that in a second. So let me move on here. So he says, goth music was born as an offshoot of post-punk from the scene in England. While punk was political, post-punk turned inward and gradually dark. The music was there before the style. Bela Lugosi's Dead by Bauhaus is widely considered to be the first goth hit, but it wasn't until the Sisters of Mercy arrived on the scene in the 1980s that goth truly came into its own. Its aesthetic codes were slowly shaped by acts like the Sisters, Susie and the Banshees, and Alien Sex Fiend, and by kids who frequented Batcave, the first goth club in London. You can see the continuation of the punk style in goth's use of bondage gear and Doc Martens, but they combine it with Victorian morning dress and heavy makeup. There was less anger and more elegance, less masculinity and more androgyny, whereas Sex Beat sang in a song that epitomized the goth style, some wear leather, some wear lace. Andy Harriman, the author of the book by the same name, described to me the relationship between the music and the style thus. Quote, since goth style was born out of the punk movement, the idea of DIY was important. It originally consisted of a bricolage of thrift store finds, dyed black, of course, one-of-a-kind items found at shops, handmade items, fetishistic elements, such as latex, buckles, fishnet, and chains, as well as found objects like chicken bones and toy parts. Most of all, it was about individuality. Fashion was incredibly close to the music, since that's what the goth subculture was based upon. The goth visual aesthetic only enhanced the music's funereal and experimental sound. Funereal and experimental sound.
Funeral.
Goth fashion and goth music, for you personally, do those two things inform one another, or are they less related to each other in your experience?
Oh, big time.
Just for you, like not as a culture, but just your own experience.
Absolutely, 100%. Goth music and goth culture, or goth music and like goth fashion, absolutely is like it's hand in hand. Like there would honestly like really be like no way that I would show up at Ariana Grande concert in my biggest Doc Martens and lace. Not that I would ever, not really my thing, but that's not something I would do. But especially because goth music in particular influences the celebration of the darker half. So pretty much, it's a celebration about death. And darkness and gloominess. It doesn't have to, like we don't have to hide away from these things. We can appreciate them for what they are. Like that article brought up like chicken bones and that sort of thing. A lot of it has, to do with alternative religions. Usually, sometimes it has to do with like animal sacrifice and that sort of thing. Some people like consider this like a rebellion against God or mainstream monotheistic religion, that sort of thing, which is fine too. But purely, goth music influences the fashion to me personally, and I think it really brings a lot of meaning to it.
What about you, Trey?
I'd say it's really hard to say. I mean, in general, I think a lot of subcultures, especially subcultures built around the appreciation of artists, public artists like bands, or just anybody who does performance art, public art, whatever. The people who gather around them, their fandom, do tend to take visual markers to show their, I guess, allegiance to, or their fandom of it, be it something as simple as band T-shirts to dressing in a style similar to the artists. And I think a lot of what goth fashion became was hugely informed by the stylistic choices of the bands that then became well known in goth circles as mainstream goth bands. So I think there's definitely a degree with which the bands and their style inform it, and then the music, of course, has its themes, and those themes have their own meanings, and then you take those meanings and you put them into the clothing. In that you're talking about funereal topics, or you're talking about embraces of death and destruction and stuff like that. And so, of course, people gravitate to, well, at least in the West, where Goth had its birth, what's associated with funerals and death. And you get to black clothing, and you get to semi-formal clothing, etc., and some of the more put together looks that are associated with Goth. So I think there's definitely a communication back and forth between the artists that produce the music and their style, and how that informs the fans of that style of music, as well as just the understanding of the meaning behind the music, and sort of those underlying meanings that are key touchstones of the music that also inform those stylistic choices. But there is also a significant amount of emphasis on the individuality, on making it your own. It's where the DIY comes in, and the idea of crafting within the sort of vague generalities that make up the Gothic style, how you make that your own, how you express what the music makes you feel, or what your feelings that you have in common with the music, whether the music is evoking them or the music is simply sympathizing with feelings you already had. You're expressing that through your own paradigm of what those articles of clothing and accessories mean to you.
Mm-hmm. I had to also, honestly, I had to also touch on the DIY aspect. That's actually really interesting because I would say even like, say, 15 years ago, our parents generally was like, "Oh my God, I would never buy a pair of ripped jeans. You could just take them home and rip them up yourself." Okay, so we did. Um, and now, with like the debut, especially like with goth fashion in particular, we've all seen like big, giant, puffy trip pants with the chains on it, and that was the thing with the inseam that was about
Some of us have worn those.
with
Yes.
the inseam that was about like 50 inches wide, and it was like, whoa. Realistically, that was it brought out like the thing initially from like bell bottoms and turned it goth. All right, cool, and then that was brought into. Later on, we see skinny jeans. Okay, plain black skinny jeans, perfect to wear to like, either your job or a funeral. Great. And then you could also, then like now it's just like, ripped jeans. It's like sometimes the more rips, sometimes it had stylish rips in them. And that came out of the do-it-yourself aspect of goth that was, necessary to really make it your own.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, the music for me personally, the music and the fashion developed coterminously. They were that's how I discovered the fashion, was through the music. And it, remains a way to present myself, whether you're talking about like band shirts or patches, or like, a lot of times merch from bands will have some kind of statement, making some kind of social or philosophical statement. So that's an element of it. But I do think those are tightly bound. And I want to say, I want to unpack the usage of the word bricolage here for a second, because it relates back to the idea of static understandings of different goth ephemera and fashion items. So I think what Andy means by using bricolage here is this idea of the combining of current and historic items to create something new, which I agree with. I think goth does that, but the way that it's used, and this is just because I read a lot of sociology books about goth, the way that it's generally used within sociology is the appropriation and recontextualization of items to communicate new meanings, which gets back to this idea of semiotics being a way to read and understand subcultural fashion, and by extension, subculture itself, and what the way it's been used. Semiotics is this idea that subculture is a direct attempt to be a solution to a problem with the parent culture. And so what that does, again, is sort of divorce fashion as a thing from context and relationship. And, I brought up previously this the way that goth fashion is used and exists within the way that it's fluid and the way that it can be read by someone else has to include like personal comfort. Who's wearing the clothing? Why are they wearing it? Why do they think they're wearing it? Not why does somebody else think they're wearing it? This sort of expression of individual identity and this two-way conversation with culture, because a lot of times the way you present yourself is meant to get a response from others, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just an expression of yourself. So there is fluidity and context there, and I think it relies again on relationship. But so as you brought up the DIY thing, I think that's how Andy is using it as an important part of DIY, taking something, repurposing it for something else. This came up a lot during when everyone on YouTube was talking about Killstar a few months ago, because of this idea that DIY fashion subverts the sort of fashion industry of consumption and excess, which leads back to the fast fashion thing, putting plastics in the oceans, glamorizing this idea that you have to buy a whole bunch of stuff and then wear it once and then buy a whole bunch of other stuff. And so that is where I think DIY is really important. I've heard some, actually, not to call Parma out, Parma brought up this idea that perhaps DIY was given rise to simply as necessity in the 80s because people were really impoverished. There wasn't this, the fashion industry that we have now, so they made do with what they had. And Parma thought that maybe DIY wasn't as relevant or a part of goth as it was. I personally think it is, and I think that it is really important, and sort of gets back to the some of that political or cultural ethos behind what is ethical and what is the best way to sort of live your life in the world.
Absolutely. I also think with, especially like speaking back to the 80s, you have to also look at advertising as well too, especially with goth. Like if you're gonna advertise, especially like something goth with, like, say, without the DIY element and compared to like the mainstream high fashion element, in order for it to like really pop out, it has to be flashy. At least that's something you see in like today's advertising. And it may not have, I didn't exactly grow up in the 80s, obviously, but it's not something that was brought out yet in like, say, visual fashion. It wasn't in like the magazines until like maybe like the late 80s, something that had to be flashy, extravagant. And then like DIY really had to come into the scene in order to make it unique.
Yes, I agree. So let me read the next couple paragraphs here and then we'll respond to that. It wasn't long before the fashion world caught on to the largely DIY goth style, partly because goth became more mainstream and partly because its aesthetic components were easy to co-opt. Already in the 80s, Mugler and Gautier appropriated that look. Then came designers with conviction. Anne
de Meulemeester.
Trey, you want to read these names?
Sure. Anne de Meulemeester, Alexander McQueen, and Rick Owens.
Yeah, I think I can do that last one. De Meulemeester. This is a waking nightmare. They incorporated goth elements because it was a close cousin of punk. Rick Owens was a young goth himself, and it was easy for him to translate goth dress codes into his brutalist visions. Quote, "When I see young goths in the street, I feel like they're my children," they said in an interview with Valerie Steele for her book Gothic Dark Glamour, which accompanied the eponymous 2008 museum exhibit she curated. McQueen, in turn, took goth style and made it larger than life by expanding on its themes of romanticism and death. But for the most part, goth style and fashion continues to represent a kind of tourism because we live in a thoroughly postmodern cultural world where referencing is no longer frowned upon, but is actually welcomed. Goth culture is condemned to be continuously mined. Quote, at this point, goth has been so bastardized, we have to just accept it. Otherwise, we would be angry all the time. Publications often call anyone who wears a black dress or has bloody red lipstick or who dons cat eye makeup as goth. There's no way around it, said Harriman. So what do you guys think about that last part?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think it really comes back down to a couple of simple elements. Like we're seeing, different like artists and stuff. Lady Gaga especially comes to mind. She had her pop, super bright, reflective poker face get up, and then you go to say like Bad Romance, and then some of her other features and some of the other fashion that we've seen her come out on the red carpet that have touched on a little bit of what someone that's really not in the goth scene, they would call it goth, honestly, with especially like her extravagant black outfit. Oh gosh, I'm trying to remember exactly what video that was, but it was especially even like certain elements of like Bad Romance that came up, and I was like, whoa, that's goth as heck, but especially even like the concept of like the people coming out of the coffins, even though everything was white in the visual image, it's like, oh, that's totally like edgy, that's goth, but it really comes back down to being the core basis of goth, being a few simple elements, and that's probably something somebody would reference to that's not exactly in the goth scene. Now somebody that's in the goth scene would touch on it a lot heavier. They would say it's goth-ish, but it's not goth, so and somebody that's in the scene would touch on it with a little bit more extra depth and texture without actually really saying it's goth influenced, yeah, maybe, but not goth per se.
So I think with this particular paragraph, at least, it's conflating two arguments, I think. So it starts with this idea that goth represents the kind of tourism, and the goth culture is continually being mined and being referenced, and in our postmodern cultural world, referencing is not bad. So that's kind of talking about the fashion industry itself and those who are taking those elements, or it's accusing them of taking these elements from the culture, putting them in their works, and trying to then get praise based on how they properly reference that stuff. And then at the same time, you've got Andy's quote where she's talking about how goth is bastardized, and she's talking about how publications often call anyone who wears a black dress or has blood red lipstick a goth. So that's less about the designers taking the ideas of goth and using them, and it's more about the publication seeing something that someone's wearing and automatically jumping to a conclusion.
Oh, absolutely.
So I see two different things here. To touch on the first one, this lambasting of the postmodern cultural view, where and demonizing referencing and all that, I don't see. Well, I guess for me, clothing has a functional purpose, and then it also does have a signaling semiotic purpose. I mean, when it comes right down to it, we wear clothing because otherwise we'd be cold, because we're up in the north and it's cold out there. And we've, of course, built on all these structures about decency and public nudity and whatnot that has been built on top of that in the civilized, quote unquote, north. But it is a very practical, functional thing and doesn't really have any meaning in and of itself other than a way to cover yourself, protect yourself from the elements and from public disapproval. So in general, clothing doesn't really have intrinsic meaning. It doesn't mean anything by itself. So the only way it gets meaning is by referencing things. Usually somebody wears something. Yeah. So someone's wearing something that they then become associated with something, and then whatever they were wearing or elements of what they were wearing are now associated with that concept. And so people will then incorporate that in their outfit when they're trying to express a similar concept. And of course, goth has been associated with edginess and with, protests against I guess, the normalcy of things, and protests against just having a la-di-da view of the world when tragedies are happening, et cetera, et cetera. So people can certainly use that in their clothing when they want to do something shocking, or they want to try to make a statement for whatever reason. They may use something like putting on a splash of black lipstick, which is very notable, or putting on some very severe black clothing. And that is how they're making their statement. And they are referencing, but that is the only way that clothing gets meaning, other than, say when you blazon a shirt with some sort of a slogan. Other than that, it only gets meaning by referencing. So you can't really demonize fashion for referencing things. And I mean, Goth has gotten a very notable meaning given to it. And so it's easy to reference, and maybe it's also lazy to reference it. So I can certainly say people who, heavily use Goth signifiers in their fashion as maybe a little bit blatant, a little bit lazy way of expressing what they're trying to express. But other than that, I can't demonize them. We're being the victims of our own success as far as being able to express these concepts and being visible in the real world. And then as far as the publications who say Taylor Swift is goth or whatever, to quote Angela's recent video, that's just publications talking out of their ass like they usually do. I mean, they don't necessarily have a good idea of things. A lot of these publications aren't, as I said before, fashion publications that know the ins and outs of fashion. They are celebrity gossip rags, and really are only talking about that from a very superficial pop culture standpoint. And so that is what the signifier is. So they take this very superficial tact and say, oh, well, this person's going goth now, apparently, rather than this person's trying to express something else just using those goth signifiers. They just totally gloss over any of that sort of meaning and just lump them into, oh, goth phase.
Yeah.
So I want to jump down the throat of this postmodernism thing, because there is actually substantial literature around aesthetic postmodernism and trying to explain what that means for fashion and culture. I think now he does try to expand on this a bit in the last paragraph, but I think the way he does it in this article is pretty lazy, because the problem is the term postmodernism basically has become like akin to the term political correctness, in that it's used to mean mutually exclusive things, because it'll get used by the left, it'll get used by Christians and atheists and right-wingers and Jordan Peterson, and everybody means their own thing, and they just kind of throw it out there, assuming that you also understand what it is, but it's vague enough to be used to sort of justify some point. And I think if you're going to use a term like that, you have to define and explain what you mean, because it's otherwise your argument just kind of sucks, because you're not if it can mean any number of things to any number of people, you have to sort of define your terms here. So I'm going to try and do that, because I think I generally understand what he's talking about. And I'm gonna go on a bit of a rant, and then I'm gonna go on another bit of a rant later. But my best guess as the way to how he's using this aligns with a view of postmodernism that separates Enlightenment modernism, which is how we view knowledge, and aesthetic modernism, which is how we express social change. So what that means for him, I think, is that fashion and art become rapid change and are fluid, divorced from broader contexts, allowing fashion to become purely individual. I think this is just kind of a too simplistic way of trying to understand the human experience and human expression. So from a postmodern view of fashion, and specifically subcultural fashion, is that subcultures are not formed around a shared ideology or resistance or some static boundary like aesthetic modernism would support. But for aesthetic postmodernism, subcultures become a simulacra. They're just a collection of interchangeable symbols and images that are divorced from cultural context. Excuse me. And meaning, and just sort of shared and swapped eternally over and over for individual play and pleasure. So there's a lot of sociology behind this that is trying to alleviate the tension between the modernist framework that understands subculture as formed in a defined opposition to neo-Marxist structures like the mainstream or the media or social order and that kind of thing. And then the postmodernist framework, which views human behavior and expression as relative and transient and fluid. But I think, again, I have problems with both of those, and I don't think either of those theoretical frameworks actually explain or understand how individuals and groups of people exist. So postmodernism, for example, has this notion of a mutual exchange of fashion that takes inspiration from other cultures. And it's the idea that that's a reaction to modernism, which came before it, is kind of silly, because that's something that has always happened. And I think another problem with this view, this aesthetic postmodernist view, is that it erases the sort of outright imperial appropriation of aesthetic and culture as any kind of a problem, because fashion becomes this free floating marketplace of aesthetics and items that anyone can take from. And when it comes to talking about appropriation, I think we need to be more thoughtful about it than just saying that anyone can take and use these out of context. And not just for goths either. I know there's a huge I listen to a lot of like Wiccan and pagan podcasts, and there's a big conversation happening about rituals and like plants that are used, like sage, and this idea of what's a colonized use of indigenous religious practices, and then what's okay for private personal use in a thoughtful way. And I think that's an important conversation to have. And just saying that, well, the culture is postmodern now, so any use of anything is fine, isn't really a solution to anything. And I think it can be a problem.
Yeah, 100% agree with you. Like, you can look at, so say, like, something that's inspired upon, like, say, like Native American headdresses. Like, that's a huge no-no.
Yeah, that's a good
Big
example.
No.
Yeah.
So it's definitely not a free-for-all thing. It's like, oh, this thing is cool, I'm just going to take the bits and pieces and not really have a connection to it. Like, no, I can't do that. Sorry.
Yeah. All right, so last paragraph here. Is this the last one? Yeah. So they say the goth look is edgy, dark, and romantic. All of these things have continuous allure because many people tend to be drawn to exoticism, to the unfamiliar other. The look is also easy to decouple from the culture itself and its values, something that postmodernism is adept at. Fashion is great at this kind of cultural appropriation, and goth culture presents an easy target. Its style can be broken down into components and be used as a kind of aesthetic paint-by-numbers kit. In turn, this allows designers to dip their toes into goth style without really committing to it. Add a cross dangling from a chain here, a choker there, throw in a pair of black patent leather boots, and you are done. You can mix these things with far less edgy garments so as not to scare off your customer base, who are unlikely to bedeck themselves in full goth regalia, which is exactly what Bottega Veneta, Prada, and Marni did in Milan. So the argument they're making here is that the goth look has a universal appeal to things like romance and death and otherness, and because of that, it's okay for anyone to use goth style outside of the context of goth culture. Basically. So how do you guys feel about that, or any other thoughts on anything from that article before I go on my epic rant about?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, really, the only thing that really comes to mind when it comes to, say, the removal of the context from the style. I mean, and a lot of people catch flack for this, but like pastel goth is a big one. And while, I'm not going to necessarily say it's not goth, a lot of people would argue that it is. But it's the separation from the gloominess of the dark. with pastel goth in particular, and that's okay. And at the same time, it's just like, it's not what you used to see going to like a concert at like a Sisters of Mercy concert. You know, you wouldn't bring your brightest pastels to, you know, a concert with the Mission. Like you wouldn't do that. That's not something you would do. You wouldn't, you know, really wear pastels to a funeral unless you're bouncing back off of the old concept that once upon a time white was actually a representation of death. So
well, I would point out it still is for some cultures,
right.
which again goes back to the idea that aesthetic presentation is contextual,
right?
And there's no, you know, it means different things in different circumstances for different people based on their sort of enactment or co-creation of their community. So you can't.
Right.
It can't be static, but I don't think you can go the opposite direction and say that nothing has any meaning and you can use it for whatever.
Yeah.
There's also, death is not universally viewed as something dark or a reason to mourn either. It can be viewed in bright colors too. It's all culturally contextual. Yeah, kind of to reiterate what I was saying before is that, I mean, and I think, Count, you said this earlier as well, that, you know, goth fashion as it stands alone isn't really doesn't make sense on its own. It is contextually it's only made relevant by the context in which it's perceived. Right. If someone's just arbitrarily, if you take a dummy and arbitrarily deck it out in something that looks goth but put it in the middle of a park, it's not necessarily, doesn't mean goth. There's nothing goth about the context. It's simply an item wearing pieces of black fabric or leather or whatever. So its meaning comes from its existence within Gothic spaces or within other Gothic contexts. So because it doesn't have a meaning in and of itself necessarily, it's, well, kind of going back also to what I was saying about, you know, when I asked the question of what is a uniquely goth fashion element, what was something that is unique to goth that wasn't yet another reference to a different fashion tradition historically or immediately predating it. And unless there is something that is unique to goth, it's very hard to then make accusations about cultural appropriation, with the exception of someone who's, you know, not involved in the scene and saying, oh, I'm being goth for Halloween. You know, that sort of thing is clearly a cultural appropriation because that person is taking the goth culture, putting together some outfit that's supposed to visually signify it, but is putting on that goth culture as a costume. But saying that someone who's wearing black lipstick or wearing a black lace gown or Doc Martens or, you know, as they said there, a cross on a chain and a choker and some black patent leather boots, somehow they are being goth culturally appropriative, is really hard to say, because they could be appropriating ecclesiastical garb. They could be appropriating BDSM. They could be appropriating biker culture. All those elements come from all these various things, and there's no way to say that this is definitely exclusively coming from goth. So making those appropriation claims on the abstract without knowing what the person who's accused of appropriating is intending is, I think, a hard thing to do just based on this abstract use of what are perceived as Gothic signifiers. Whereas, as I said before, using these Gothic signifiers in a fashion sense to make a statement is, you know, perhaps just a lazy and blunt way of doing it, rather than thinking of your own way to express something. You're taking this ready-made, oh, if I just dress all in black and put on the black makeup, I show how I'm protesting the tragedies of the world, or protesting the fact that the world is trying to cut down people who want to be creative and individualistic, or something else of that nature. So yeah, it's just, I'm of many minds of this. The cultural appropriation angle is a very sticky wicket to try to figure out. There are lots of people who get offended by things that are culturally appropriative, or that they believe are culturally appropriative when they're not. We've already mentioned the Indian headdresses. And yeah, there's very little other.
Right.
When it comes to a full-on war bonnet style Indian headdress, there's very little to say, okay, this could be something else. But then it's been generalized to, oh my God, you're wearing a feathered headdress. How dare you culturally appropriate that when, maybe they're Brazilian and that's part of their culture too. Or, some African cultures where feathered headdresses are part of the culture, or Celtic and Gaelic cultures where feathered attire are part of the Druidic tradition. So just because you see feathers and jump to the most visible and newsworthy use of that, and all of a sudden you get all up in arms about cultural appropriation, shows a lack of understanding and nuance in and of itself.
Right.
So it's very hard sometimes to figure out what is cultural appropriation and what is not, from the abstract, from the outside, barring the person who's doing the appropriation making a statement about their intent.
Right. And I think that's where pretty much we would go back to coming from like a reference of somebody that's outside of the culture compared to somebody that's part of the culture. Somebody that's part of the culture would know more or less, okay, like, is this cultural appropriation or not? And I would think that's where, somebody would refer to that person or that reference or whatnot and say, hey, is this, do you think somebody that's part of a specific tribe would know their tribe colors, tribe patterns, that sort of thing, to know whether or not, okay, is this appropriative or not? In the same reference that these designers, publishers, advertisers, if you will, would consider referencing somebody that's part of, goth culture, if you will, to say, hey, what is goth? They would ask that question, like, what is goth and what do you consider goth? Would you consider this? They would bring a concept, goth.
Yeah, and I will mention, since this has come up several times, I have plans to this year do an episode with someone who is part of an indigenous tribe and also goth, to talk about some of these issues. So I just want to mention that, because once talking around these issues is good, but obviously we want to get a voice of someone from that culture, like we've been saying, and especially underrepresented cultures that have been subject to lots of abuse and colonization and that kind of thing. So I do have plans to have somebody on to get their perspective on it. So just throwing that out there.
Do you plan to bring up social repose in that conversation?
I hope so.
Okay.
Yeah. I know that's a
That's
couple
the
years
big
old now,
known
but
one,
yeah.
but yeah.
So, all right, let me rip into this here. So, as an aside, first of all, you can't use postmodernism to explain goth fashion on the runway and also bring up fashion as a cycle like they did in the second paragraph, because the way that postmodern fashion is understood is the opposite of the modernist conception of fashion trends. Postmodern fashion is all about endless blending and reblending in a context where all styles are accessible at all times. And this bricolage of style is what supposedly replaced the rigid, defined flow from one fashion to the next, which is part of the modernist framework. So I think they're kind of undermining their own argument by trying to appeal to sort of mutually exclusive ways of understanding fashion. But I also think that the concern for commodification, which is brought up, comes out of this quest for authenticity and a way that we can have a clear, demarcated who's with us and who's not with us. The problem with that, though, is it raises these questions of, how do we decide what is genuine? And I think what a lot of people miss is the fact that goth identity and the way that you earn respect as a goth has always been fluid and contextual. Because what people tend to do is try and create this, what I think is a fictional version of history in which there was an original moment of collective authenticity. And so once you do that, you don't have to account for the variety of individual expression that we see today. And you can easily dismiss someone as being a poser or being inauthentic by appealing to this moment of collective authenticity. But to do that, you have to create an abstraction. So when you're deciding what is goth or what is subculture or what is mainstream or what is the state, we just kind of pick and choose a collection of attributes from that to kind of fit whatever our narrative is and represent an entire concept. The problem is we ignore other attributes and we end up creating an abstraction, something that's not a sort of reified thing. So going back to the early theorists, the early sociological theorists, for them it was class. Everyone was neatly divided into a class. You had the working class, and they formed a counter response to hegemony or the mainstream, and that was the authentic version of subculture. But what that does is ignore the diversity of membership, how memberships were porous, people would move from one group to another group, and it ignores the specific historical conditions of the formation of those group of people, which is something we talked a lot about on a Patreon discussion we recently did for the Evolution of Goth book review. And in that discussion, I kind of talk about how I try to alleviate and understand this notion of authenticity. So if you guys want to check that out, I'll link it. But I personally know, and I think a lot of us know, people in the goth community that will say anything past the 80s or the 90s isn't true goth and not worth wasting time on. And that goes back to this idea, this idealized past, this sort of moment of authenticity, which again fails to recognize the complexity of just cultures and people and individuals. And you're constructing this top-down version of culture, or if you're a philosopher, you'd call that an a priori position. And you start you start your understanding with a preconceived rigid structure like class, which is a real material agent, and then everyone within that group becomes one and the same in order to explain the purpose of that group, because we're trying to understand why are these people in this group and how do we put them in a box to fit them into the rest of the culture. But again, you're ignoring individual experience. So I don't think we can understand these structures and group relations as anything more than abstractions that we assign some traits to and ignore other traits. Because if you really look from person to person within a subculture, it's not this internally homogenous and externally demarcated group that is completely, homogenous, just all the same with no variance. And all you have to do is look at the debates on the internet to kind of prove that point.
But I'm an individual just like everybody else.
Yeah. I'm an individual. We just all wear the same boots. Yeah. So this idea of subculture as static, frozen in time entities that are coded and homogenous doesn't really resonate with everyday experience, I think. If you do any sort of ethnographic work and interview people in a culture, you don't really get that sense. You can't rectify that framework with a lived experience. And I think some people still use that conception of subculture without really thinking through it, and that ends up turning a lot of people off, because the way that they get treated is they feel their experience isn't valid because it doesn't fit with this preconception of some magical moment of pure authenticity. And especially when you get into talking about like purity of heritage and authenticity, that becomes really problematic really quickly. But the thing is, that's what a lot of sociologists do. They have these structural entities of the state and the media and subculture, and they become these reified material entities. There's a good example of this in the book that a lot of people reference, called Goth Undead Subculture. They use the same theoretical structure to make the argument that goth is a middle-class subculture. And they use that same neo-Marxist framework to explain how it fits within a broader community. But that fails, again, to explain cross-class participation, which is a very real thing, and you end up alienating individuals who are truly part of the goth culture, but because they don't fit into this top-down structure, they get excluded. And so we have to understand that these groups are made of individuals, and individuals are complex and contextual, and it's the members of the group who are the agents, not the other way around. But when you have this idea of these pre-given structures, it leads to that endless, what is goth? What is true goth? And you can't really answer those questions with these neat conceptual boxes. You have to have something that prioritizes individualism and moment-to-moment creation and enactment of reality. Because if you appeal to some historical moment of true authenticity, that requires you answer questions like, how do we draw a line between the originators and the hangers-on? And how do we explicitly delineate true goths from fake goths? What is the pre-given criteria for an authentic goth community? And those questions just kind of get ignored, and people just appeal to some vague notion of authenticity without really defining it, which is, it just doesn't work. Like you have to define it, and if you do define it, it's not going to fit across all goths or across all goth communities. And so I think when we're looking at modernist conceptions, we're looking at postmodernist conceptions, we have to recognize that there is a complexity, and that these things, these identities and these fashions and these communities exist around relational moments and multiplicity of individual identities. And we have to use that to understand how subculture is constructed in a consistently distinctive and fluid way. Because if we don't, and we assume that subculture is static and is reducible to these defined sartorial, signifying fashion items, then, whether that's a resistance to class dynamics or whatever, then yeah, you get into commodification, and that does become the death of subculture, because that meaning is stripped away, and then you have nothing that is subversive or transgressive. But obviously, the commodification argument has never made sense to me, because goth has been commodified for years, and it's still around, and it's still meaningful for individuals. So
right. Well, I think I said it in a previous podcast too. I think that idea that commodification would be the death of something like the goth subculture is a self-limiting system, in that it's commodified because it's subversive. And if it becomes so commodified that it loses its subversive edge, then it will stop being commodified, and it will become subversive again. And for those who have, for those to whom it has an intrinsic value, they won't lose that value. For those to whom the value is only based on the extrinsic factors of how subversive it is, it loses value in their world, and they'll stop doing it. So, those who are truly involved and interested in the subculture and its signifiers, they shouldn't be affected by that at all, other than perhaps the idea that people who have temporarily commodified it and then made acts gave the rest of society a different idea about what it means to be a part of the subculture, and oftentimes a harmful view of what that is, which those of us who are, more integrally or more, situated within the subculture have to continually fight against.
Album review.
We are reviewing the album from Sólveig Matthildur. How would you say that, Trey?
That's pretty close. Sólveig Matthildur.
Okay. So Sólveig Matthildur is the solo project of the synth performer in Kaelin Mikla from Iceland, and the co-founder of of another band. No, it's not a band. It's a magazine. I have no way of pronouncing that. Sorry, guys.
Yeah, I'm not looking at the page, so I can't help you there.
Yeah, find out what
I
Google
can copy
says.
paste it. It is a magazine publication about the Icelandic underground music scene.
Myrkfelni.
So that's pretty cool.
I'd go with
sorry.
Myrkfelni.
Okay.
That could be a butchering, but that's what I'd go with.
She self-released her debut album, Unexplained Miseries and the Acceptance of Sorrow, in August 2017, which recently received the Crowmer Awards. Working primarily with synthesizers, strings, and voices circling around 40 hertz that eventually start beating with your heart, taking you on a journey through unexplained miseries to the acceptance of sorrow. All right, so
if your heart's beating at 40 hertz, you've got some problems.
You're a goth. That's the problem. So we're going to play a track from the album, and I thought I wrote it down. Apparently, I forgot to write it down. Let me look at the track 6. Constantly Heartbroken.
Oh my God, I have already realized that's my jam.
Yeah, so we're going to play that right now. Enjoy.
ahead and go first. Pretty much. Honestly, like, actually, I realized that "Constantly Heartbroken" is honestly like probably my favorite song off this album. So I checked it out, and the vocals kind of in a way reminds me of Emily Autumn in a way, but only like not as raspy as Emily Autumn, but very very like nice haunting vocals. It really holds like a new wave goth aesthetic. So I really like it. It's definitely something I'm probably going to be buying and adding to my playlist. So it's definitely I enjoy it a whole lot. So it's good. Yeah, like the other one, I really like that. My father taught me how to cry. So that one was number 5. Had a nice little start to it, and then just like brought it in vocally, and so it was very. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it a lot. Like the other one, I kind of like touched on the first one, "Constantly in Love." I really liked that one too. So
Cool. Trey, what did you think about the album?
I also really enjoyed it. I mean, it was very. I mean, I also gave a fairly positive review of Kaylin Mikla when we listened to them as well. But I enjoyed her solo work a little bit more than Kaylin Mikla because I felt she was stretching her legs a little bit more and had more variety in her music. It was a really interesting journey through the playlist of shifting moods. It wasn't just one sound that kept going the entire way through. And there are some things that, were more, I guess you want to say, goth appropriate versus stretching the elements. So I wouldn't necessarily call it a goth record, but certainly a record that had a number of tracks that were very, very gothic. But it definitely had a significant dream pop, psychedelia aspect to it, more the dream pop and the ambient side of things. I thought it was very reminiscent of, some of the big '90s dream pop shoegaze type feel. Though more stripped back, not quite as wall of sound as that. So reminiscent of what you get on like a Project Records or Seraph or even 480 from the 80s. That's a lot of the feel I got from it. But overall, I mean, I really enjoyed it. I listened to the first few tracks and I pretty much bought it right away. I was very happy with the album.
And I will echo that. I don't have a protracted sort of thing review of it. I had to be transparent. I listened to it a couple times earlier in the week, and then I had a bunch of family shit happen, and I kind of wasn't able to get back to it. But from my experience with the album, because I listened to the album, and then I listened to the most recent Kaylin Mikla album, and then I listened back to this. And I can certainly hear similarities and sort of a connection to that band. But I would say Kaylin Mikla is more built for a more upbeat, dancey sort of goth club environment. I know we talked in the last episode about how nobody plays ethereal music anymore, but it is made more for a club dance kind of thing. Although I think this is certainly very danceable. It's not club dance kind of thing, right? I love, I played Constantly Heartbroken. I wasn't sure if that was the best choice because that's, if you hit play on Bandcamp, that's the first one that plays, but it's certainly the most dancey track on the album, and it's not necessarily indicative of everything else because for me, it was the sort of emotional impact it had was this very more, I mean, cold wave and art and post-punk and like all, synth pop, all that influences in there. But emotionally, it was very kind of like dirge-like and introspective and depressive in some parts. And I feel like I was actually missing a lot by not going through the lyrics because, I mean, some of it's in English, some of it isn't. But I feel like there's probably a lot of depth to the messages coming across, and I'm going to spend some more time with that in the future. But this was I really enjoyed this album because when I, going back to when I was first getting into goth, my loves were synth pop and ethereal music. Like either like neoclassical or, you know, like Dead Can Dance or that kind of thing, the sort of romantic haunting melodies and that stuff that you can just kind of sway to and get lost in. That was like my jam, and this really brought a lot of that back for me. Obviously there are a lot of new bands now that are in, like, I guess comparable genres within the scene, like Haunt, Minuet Machine, who else? I can't think of any more. Kayla Mikla, obviously. But this, for whatever reason, really hit on that at that core of what I love about haunting, sort of ethereal electronic music. So I really, really enjoyed it. And if you are into that sound, this is certainly something you want to pick up.
So you've got to be interested in death. It's the last great taboo. It's the only taboo left.
Precisely. I mean, why is it, do you think, that everyone in here is dressed in black? It's a celebration of death.
No, I just like the clothes.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, the clothes look good. Yeah, I mean, death looks good. Charles Manson, yeah? No, he was cool.
Don't know if I mentioned it before, but I'm actually a vampire.
Sinister Suggestions.
I picked two artists. One of them is actually Curly. So I don't know if you guys know Curly from back when she did Walking on Air, like, God, maybe like a decade ago. This was very like poppy, like a lot of synth pop, that sort of thing, new gen pop, very bright, perky, happy, that sort of thing. Well, she just recently came out with Shadow Works. And wow, it is a stark contrast. And I think it kind of gave birth out of her like awakening to like Estonian witchcraft. So it's a very unique album. And honestly, like it's like super pagany and very dark in its way. There's a song she has on there called Where the Dark Things Are, and the first part of the lyrics is ashes to ashes, burn down my churches. And I'm like, whoa, okay. That album I've been jamming since. So the second artist I had to bring up is MXMS, literally just the letters MXMS. And just what I mentioned is called funeral pop. She literally describes her own category as funeral pop. And that's also the title of her album, too. And honestly, the first time I heard her was actually live. And it was a stark contrast from the typical, like, goth rock music. Because she's very, it's like, it's pop. But it's not like pop in the traditional sense where I'm singing about, my boyfriend's breakup and all this other stuff and, happy clouds and all this other stuff. And it's like, no, she has this other song. She literally just talks about, I can't wait to wait to see you when I'm being let down into my grave. And I'm like, oh, all right. This is dark as heck. Like, all right. Yeah. But her album, which is Funeral Pop 1, is really good. And that's something I play on my way home from work every day, because every day I get home from work, I feel like I'm dying. So this is perfect.
Very nice. Trey, what do you got?
All right. Well, I've got a book and also an album. So the book has been mentioned in discussion before. I think Andy Harriman mentioned it either when she was on the podcast or maybe when she and I had our discussion. But it's Art, Sex, Music. It's the autobiography of Kosi Fanny Tutti of Throbbing Gristle and Chris and Cozy fame. I've been reading that right now, and I'm not done with it, but I'm about halfway to 2/3 of the way through it. And I've really been enjoying it. It's a really interesting exploration of the late 60s, early 70s art scene and some of the experimental art movements like Fluxus around Europe and then also in the US. And then some of that early birth of the punk transition to post-punk. And of course, with Cozy and Throbbing Gristle going down the more industrial performance art side of it. but it's a very interesting book. I'm really enjoying it. It's a bit harrowing in that it's definitely tales of working class British life and not being accepted and being exploited and all that stuff. So she had a eventful but not necessarily entirely pleasant life as portrayed in the book. But it's very engrossing, very interesting to hear about that scene. And then the album is by a band that is on one of these tabs here. There it is. The band is Pensée Nocturne, and the album is Grand Guignol Orchestra. So the band, I found them just because they were described as clown metal. So that's kind of what I got. But really, it's a mix of kind of dark cabaret / carnival style music and songs. So sort of that French cabaret style, that dark cabaret that's been getting some traction in goth, or not been getting, had gotten some traction in goth circles around the turn of the millennium. I think it's kind of on the wane now, but I still enjoy some good dark cabaret. But it's mixing that with black metal. And I find it very interesting. So I've been enjoying it. I think some of their other albums are similar in that they do tend to have a lot of the old, French style cabaret musical touches as part of their aesthetic. But this particular album I thought was very good and does lean, in my opinion, a little bit more towards the dark cabaret than the black metal, which works for me because I'm not a huge black metal fan. But I am always a huge fan of seeing disparate elements mixed together in crazy ways. So just calling something clown metal was enough to get my interest. So those are my suggestions.
Nice.
Very cool. I am not recommending any music this week. I've got a product suggestion. I know. How dare I? People in Discord have actually been saying you're making too many music recommendations. I can't keep up. So I'm going to talk about something else.
Give us your filthy consumerism.
Yeah. No, this is actually really, really fucking cool. So 2 years ago, a friend of mine in Germany who is an expat put together very kindly a care package for me from Wave Gothic Treffen because she knew I've always wanted to go and she wanted to pick up some ephemera and things for me. And a couple of the things she sent me were these soaps. And one of them was like, it's kind of like a regular soap bar that looked like oatmeal. And one of them was a just black, thick coffin. They smell fucking amazing. There were two different things. The coffin one is like, it's got like 5 or 6 ingredients in it, but there's patchouli and there's like cedar and some more sort of scents I would associate with incense, and just really well balanced, smells beautiful. And you rub this like black soap all over your skin and you smell incredible. And then the other one is more, I don't know if I could describe the scent, but it's more like exfoliating and also smells wonderful. And these come from someone who is now a friend of mine, Annie. Her shop is called Siefenhex or Siefenhexe. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but I'll put a link to her Etsy in the show notes. And she handcrafts and like cold presses these soaps. She does oils and a lot of like witchy stuff. You don't have to buy it for witchy things. You can just get it because they smell amazing. Like she does oils and perfumes and some other things. But the soaps are incredible. You can get those on Etsy right now.
I'm like on Etsy right now.
Like,
how do I spell that?
So I'll send you the link. Like, honestly, these things changed my life as far as, because I don't care about soaps and scents and stuff, but it's just super like the gothest fucking thing ever, and I love them. And like personally, as a witchy kind of thing, I've used them as sort of like cleansing rituals in the shower before a different ritual or ceremony or something like that. But just from like a pure goth perspective, this is really cool because it's an individual person making these and putting them on Etsy, and it's just like peak goth in my opinion. Here's the link. I'll put it in chat. But yeah, and also if you're if you're pagan or witchy inclined, this is part of like her craft. She does pagan stuff and makes it for that type of use. But I definitely check these out. I think they're wonderful. And I actually I contacted her about buying these because I have used mine up. So some of these perfumes like Batcave Gothic perfume, witchcraft, fetish Gothic perfume, unknown pleasures perfume. So
they're basically
really cool.
all
and then she's got
goth songs.
Ooh.
More or less.
Yeah. And she does like one-off soaps. I think you can actually contact her about some of the other ones because they're not listed on Etsy, but she's got like skulls and some soaps that are pressed with some sort of Victorian framed photo kind of thing. I think you can actually Facebook message her or email her on Etsy and ask for like custom ones because she's got a lot of like one-off things that are really, really cool.
Yeah,
But
I'm like looking at her shop right now and I'm just like, whoa, my whole paycheck is about to be like
yeah, well, I mean, they're pretty decently priced, especially if you compare it to
this is
something
phenomenal.
like who's the big goth like perfume.
I think you're
place that
thinking
everybody-
B-Pal, Black Phoenix Alchemy Lab.
Oh yeah.
Black Phoenix, yeah.
Yeah, that's B-Pal.
Yeah, those are much more expensive than these.
So when we end up doing our Ren Fair meetup, I'll have to take you by the soap shop there, which is also pretty good. No black coffin soaps though.
CC, do you have any projects or social media you would want to direct people to if they want to get in contact with you? Or
You can actually find me, especially on Twitter, under Corvid X Queen. So that's CORVID X Queen. And also I'm on PlayStation under the same username. So when you catch me on Mortal Kombat 11, which I just downloaded, yes, let me tell you, I just downloaded yesterday because it's on sale, and wow, best Mortal Kombat they did. Wow.
I don't do fighting games, but
Yes, you do.
I've
Just
heard-
not that
Yeah.
one-on-one fighting games.
well, those, yeah. I did just download God of War was half off, and I was
It's
like,
good.
I'm finally buying
It's
this.
good.
So,
Yeah, I played it. Actually, when I got my PS4, I got discount code, and I played it, and I was like, whoa, it was good. It's good. Good addition.
I only played up through the first boss, but I put it on with my wife, and we watched through that whole intro, and we were just like weeping. I was like, I am so sad
Wait
right now.
until you like get like halfway through the game, because like there's some major plot twists in there. You're gonna be like, wait, what?
man. Cece, again, thank you so much for coming on. It was a
Thank
pleasure
you.
to
Yes,
speak
thank
with
you.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for speaking to you guys. It was super awesome being here.
Cece, thank you again so much for spending time with us. That was truly a pleasure. In 2 weeks, we will be back with another episode. We're going to be chatting with the head writer and creative consultant for Carpe Noctem magazine. Yeah, throwback to the 90s, and as a goth in the early 2000s, Carpe Noctem was a big deal for me. So we're going to be sitting down with an interview with Tom to talk about that time, that era, and I think that's going to be a lot of fun. As we close out the show, I just wanted to say, I put this on Facebook, and I think it might be worth repeating here. If you made it this far, obviously, you are one of the super fans. You really enjoy the show. You want to hear what's going on with the show, what we're doing, and you're committed. And that means a lot to me. It really, really does. And, I just want to sort of reaffirm that we don't take ads for the show, and we won't take ads for the show. Not that I'm in a position where I'm being offered thousands of dollars to put advertisements on the podcast, but that's not something that I'm going to do. And the reason this came up for me was because a YouTuber that I really enjoy their content started posting videos that were basically just 20-minute advertisements. And it really bummed me out, and as a podcast listener, there are shows I have stopped listening to because they'll put 2 ads in the beginning, 3 ads, halfway through, 2 ads at the end. And at a certain point, it's just beyond what is enjoyable for me. This is my own personal preference. And I also know on personal preference that it would be difficult to retain a commitment to the standards and ethics I have around how we report on and review and talk about stuff on the show if I knew that that was under the flag of a paid advertisement. So not that anyone who does that is doing anything wrong, but I think for me, it would lead to some inauthentic content, and that's not what I want. I want to be free to do what I think is right for the show and what you guys think is right for the show, and not be beholden to some contract or commitment with a third party. This is between you and me. What that means, though, is that the show rides or dies on listener support. If you decide that the show isn't really useful or meaningful anymore and don't want to support the podcast, that's fine. I would rather, as I said, I'd rather go gracefully into the night than continue making tortured or strained content just for the sake of making content. That's not what I want. That's not what the show is about. And it's not what the culture that I love and have grown up with and am so committed to, I made an entire show about it, is about either. So all that to say, from the bottom of my heart, thank you to everyone who is supporting us on Patreon. That's why I'm sure plenty of people skip past the last 2 or 3 minutes of the show because I'm just reading out people's names, and that's fine. But it means so much to me that you guys want to support what we're doing that it is worth taking the time to read your names. And it's completely true when I say this, that you are the show. You are putting this out there into the world because you think it's valuable. And that means everything to me. So with that, I'm going to read off our Patreon supporters for the month of May. As we do, starting at the founders level, we've got SJ, Esmeralda, Abigail, Stella, Samantha, and Christine. And many of you have been with us for a long time. And many of our Patreon supporters have been with us for a long time and engaging and giving feedback. And it's truly, truly humbling. Truly, honestly, the most incredible and fulfilling project I've ever done in my life. And the fact that you guys support it, I can't even really dwell on it because it's so incomprehensible and so big and so overwhelming that it's amazing. You guys are amazing. At the Nocturnal Council level for May, we have Dawn, Jason of Junkyard Bat on Etsy, Christina, Esther, Sav, Natalie, Michelle, DJ Azzy of Obscura Undead, Michelle of Skullgirdle RIP on YouTube, Cadaver Kelly of Cadaver Kelly on YouTube, Amber, Trey, Fifth Dream, Nephilim Incorruptus, also on YouTube. Eternal Winter, another YouTuber I recommend checking out. Check them all out. If you don't know, you should know. I'm sure you probably already do. Stevie, Amy, Mike Mess, and William. Thank you all so much for your support. And then at the Crow's Call level, we have Dave of the Goth subreddit on Reddit, Isabel, Audra, Kevin, Top Down Tom, Sarah, Morgan, David, Jen, Irene, Barnabas, Abby, Jonathan, Brittle Things, Becca, Kelly, Dom, King Rhinex, Vokun, Marco, Alex, Eduardo, Jan, Jason, Neon Zagain, who I think at the time of that this publishes, we'll have released a brand new EP. Stuart, Isabel, Margarita, Marissa, Jamie, Kimberly, Iris, Alex of the We Have a Technical podcast. If you're not listening to it, you should be. Richard, Mr. Polar Bear, Dagger Dance, Caroline of Caroline Sometimes, who just recently went through and posted all of their Wave Gothic Treffen coverage, which congratulations to everyone who is back from Wave Gothic Treffen. A lot of first-timers in our Discord, our Patreon Discord, got to go, and that's really, really cool to see. I hope you guys had an amazing experience. Alana, Bronwyn, David, Country Fried Goth, who you can find on YouTube, Mark, Gendalis, Angel, Anne, Heather, Jay Internus, Wolfie, Kelly, Ryan, Susan, Kay, and Beth. And if I don't have my notes with me this time, if I blanked on your project, I apologize. Please send me an angry email and remind me so that I don't fuck this up next time. Thank you all so much for your support. I won't bleat on about my undying love for all of you, but thank you again. That's it for us. You can catch us on Discord. If you want to join Patreon, you can go to patreon.com/Cemetery Confessions to see what kind of rewards you can get. Of course, we will be back in 2 weeks. So until then, stay dark.
The preceding program is a member of The Belfry, a network of blogs, podcasts, and videos for the darkly inclined. Go to thebelfry.rip for more information.
And what's up? I gotta leave the door closed, buddy.
Why?
Are you going to bed?
No, I just want you to leave the door open in case I watch any scary videos.
Well, don't watch any scary videos. That'll solve your problem.
What does Link think
Well,
of
I
black
want-
clothing?
Think someone turned into a wolf.
Someone turned into a wolf? That's
Yeah.
pretty cool.
I mean a werewolf.
Link, what do you think about black clothing?
It feels nice.
It feels nice.
I still like it, so what are you doing anyway?
All right. I'm recording a podcast, so I got to keep the door closed because I have the camera on and I don't want anyone walking naked past the door. So I got to keep the door closed, but you can come back and check on me in a little while.
What?
Yeah.
It's crazy sounding.
Crazy sounding, right?
I want you to see someone naked.
Well, that's a little weird, but all right, go watch your videos.
Oh my god.
What, Mom?
All right, bud. I'll come check on you in a little bit, okay? Oh, goodness. All right.
Anyway.
Oh, he's coming back. Hey, what's up? Yeah. Okay.
I really hope some of that makes the cut.